if your goal is to live to 70 without dementia, without heart attack, without type 2 diabetes, without cancer, the science is super clear that we should be over-indexing on plant diversity and then including animal foods almost as a side dish or a treat. People get really het up, as you said, it's more religious. I once was called part of the plant-based agenda.
Right,
and I didn't even know there was one. We don't eat macros. So people always say to me, like, what's the ideal gram per kilogram? And I think, who has the mental space to calculate this? I don't, right? And it's my literal job. So when food becomes a source of anxiety and when people start to think that their nutrition is actually a mental burden for them, we failed.
I mean, it's fantastic that you're joining me. We've spoken at length online and it feels like I've known you for a while without actually ever meeting you, which is great. You know, when it comes to nutritional research and just nutritional opinions online, I feel people are very dogmatic, and nutrition, even though it shouldn't be, has taken this binary approach where it's either this camp or that camp. But actually, nutritional research, it's so variable, it's constantly changing, but also more importantly, it's personalized and specific for different people. And at different points in your life, that will change. The needle on what you'll require will change as well. And that's where I really wanted to start this conversation in. You know, if we take someone who's about to become pregnant, for example, or who is pregnant, why is it that someone's nutritional requirements will be dictated by a certain physiological change in a person's life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And the way you've set it up is perfect. It's this idea that needs change as situations change. So having the same nutritional needs for your whole life is impossible because we do evolve and change and age, and it means you're still alive, which is great. So with pregnancy, it's a really important one. And it's where, I guess, where my love for understanding nutrition as a tool to improve health really started, is in pregnancy nutrition. And that is because there is this massive physiological change in pregnancy. So you have the formation of an entire new organ to house an entire new life, and the woman's body, like the physiology, the way it has to change, the organs rearrange themselves, hormones change. It's really like a 360 overhaul. I find the immune system changes are also fascinating. Our immune system essentially has to stand down to let this new being evolve inside us without our immune system attacking it as an external thing, which can happen in some complications. So, you know, when you think about it and you look at it in this way, it makes sense that our body has particular needs and it has additional requirements to build this extra organ to help build this new life, you know, but in the same breath, this all happens without us having to think about it. And pregnancies happen and go to full term and produce healthy babies all the time, often without any intervention or any additional sort of support. So there's a balance, I think, in nutrition science where I would say we understand quite a lot of the basics. And I would suggest that there's few things that we're going to do a full 180 on. You know, we discover new things that might help us to explain how something works quite a lot. I think the gut microbiome is such a good example of that. You know, from thinking about the gut as a tube that food just passes down and things get absorbed and then you poop the rest out, we now know there's this entire universe in there, this ecosystem. And that hasn't changed the entire way we think about the gut, but it's just added a layer for us to understanding, okay, this is how the gut is also influencing other parts of our body, or this is thanks to the gut microbiome, we now have a better understanding of the synergistic effect of foods. How do these foods improve health? It's partly mediated by the gut microbiome. So I think in nutrition science, I would say that the majority of what we know will support good health is fairly stable. There are some things that will change, some ways of approaching it that will be enriched or will become slightly more nuanced. And then to your point and to what we were talking about, there are specific life phases that have additional requirements and that we should make an extra effort in supporting people with, because you can have such an impact. Pregnancy is the best one. Like pregnancy is like a 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 if it's multiples. You get to improve maternal health, you get to impact pregnancy health, you get to impact the offspring's health in the short and long term. It's like the best bang for your buck. And that's why so much public health nutrition intervention is aimed at antenatal care, pregnancy, and for early years on a global scale.
If we dial in on the pregnancy and pre-pregnancy stages, as you mentioned there, the human body is supporting the building of another life form. And so you need to provide the raw ingredients for that, the omega-3 fatty acids, the calcium, vitamin D, iodine, all of those essential things for building bones, muscle, nervous system, different, organ tissues. But also that requires a lot of output from the mother, themselves. There's a lot of, nutrient extraction going on there. So actually it's an increased nutrient requirement for both parties. Yeah. In my own experience of speaking to friends, but also speaking to patients that I've seen over the years who maybe are undergoing bowel surgery whilst in the middle of pregnancy or things like that, many people aren't necessarily aware of certain nutritional requirements that may be beneficial for just, improving outcomes just a little bit more. Like, I think a lot of people are beginning to realize now that, when they're pregnant, they should be taking folic acid and B12, to reduce the risk of neural tube defects and other neurological problems that could occur. But actually something that they should be doing is that same thing, but even when trying. So if you're trying,
yes,
6 months before you become before conception, you should be, increasing your nutrients then. So it's that sort of understanding that it's a longitudinal picture, not just when the problem arises or when the event arises, you should be making a change.
Yeah, I mean, you're literally, it's this preventative model, or it's not even prevention. In the case of pregnancy, it's preparation, I would say. And I find this really interesting because, as I mentioned, when you look at the global picture, there is a lot of intervention for actually intervening in women who are fertile, full stop. So not trying to conceive, not newly pregnant. Like, how can we just improve the nutritional status of fertile women generally? And interestingly, so this is what, when you study nutritional public health, you do a lot of this. You look at antenatal care models and you understand like what's effective, what isn't. How did we get to a place where Kenya, for example, has like a 96% breastfeeding rate to 6 months? Amazing. So what's interesting for me now, like working in the UK, is we haven't done that here, right? We haven't needed to. Of course, there's different needs for low-income countries. It's really important that we intervene and support to improve outcomes. But here, there's not enough education at a population level so that individuals can be aware that actually, to your point, 3 to 6 months before conception is when actually nutrient status needs to be optimized to make sure that sperm quality, sperm function, egg quality, egg function are optimal, that maternal iron levels can support a pregnancy. And that, there's some of the most recent estimates I've read are that around 40% of women under the age of 25 are iron deficient. Doesn't paint a good picture for pregnancy outcomes, right? So, or for getting pregnant. So I think what's missing now is having a really open and honest conversation where this becomes mainstream knowledge. So I think traditionally, when you look to, in past generations, when females sort of came of age and were able to have children, there was quite a lot of attention traditionally put on their nutrition, keeping them sort of relaxed and safe and ready to conceive. Now, of course, we've moved beyond that, and women aren't just there to procreate, which is certainly something that, we celebrate and it's great, but we've completely lost the narrative of like, what do we actually need to do to prepare for pregnancy? And what I'm seeing now is a trend in bringing some of that back. So that there's these really interesting postnatal retreats and things where you basically set yourself up to recover post-birth. All of this needs to come back. We need to start talking about preparing for pregnancy and move away from this idea that, we'll just see when it happens. Like, we'll just, there's such focus on contraception at schools and in teens to help bring down teen pregnancy, which has now come down. So that's worked. But I think now the narrative has been so strongly about how to not get pregnant, how to absolutely avoid getting pregnant, how to avoid getting STIs needed, right? Let's be clear, that we've lost touch with, okay, but what happens to ensure that you have the best possible setup when you do want to get pregnant? And I would say like this also includes having a really frank conversation about the effects of age in men and women on fecundity. Like, it's not popular, but it's the truth that our biology has not caught up with our modern lifestyles. So we still are the most fertile we will ever be between the ages of about 19 and 25, right? That is our peak. And then for both males and females, it starts to go down. Men have a bit longer. So male fertility starts to drop after about 35. But so we have to have these conversations, make it a mainstream topic, and be able to advise people, okay, if you're thinking you might have kids in the next year or 6 months or so, or at least you're going to stop actively trying not to have kids, right? Then what you eat, whether you're drinking or not, whether you're smoking or not, whether you're taking recreational drugs or not, that is all going to influence not only the potential success of the pregnancy, but also the long-term health effects of the offspring. And often people don't really realize that there's such a sort of warm-up to the pregnancy itself. So this antenatal care. And to your point, folic acid, I mean, folic acid supplementation is really required 3 months pre-pregnancy. And then by week 8, like the job's done. So if you think people who are not necessarily going into conception with a planning mentality, they might only discover they're pregnant at week 6 or week 5. And if they haven't been supplemented with folic acid, they're at higher risk of, and I'm not saying everyone, obviously a lot of people don't supplement, everything's okay, but we're missing that spot just pre-conception, where that's really where we need to be optimizing nutrient status, especially because many women suffer with morning sickness. So it's incredibly difficult to advise somebody to optimize their nutrient status when they're feeling nauseated all day. Like that's an extra pressure that, frankly, having been through it myself, it's like, I can't eat. I can't even eat 3 meals a day, let alone make them nourishing meals with like oily fish when I'm green in the face is the last thing I'm going to eat. So I think we need to empower couples and parents to say that if you do this bit of work just preconception, you're going to set yourself up for the best success.
I think it was a good point that you made about not just being concerned about that short-term status, but more about the offspring's long-term health outcomes. And I think the developmental origins of health and disease theory suggested, in line with that what a mother eats during the pregnancy can actually dictate the long-term risk of obesity, chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases. And I wonder, yes, whether it's something, in that developmental stage, while there's a growing fetus, but also, as we alluded to before, the role of the microbiome as well, as we know that what we intake in terms of our diet manipulates the gut microbiome, the population of microbes. And then that will then dictate whether it's the vaginal microbiome, the skin microbiome, if it's a C-section, breastfeeding, all of that is influenced by the mother's diet during pregnancy, which then influences the baby.
Yeah.
And that, first 1,000 days, first 3 years is really when you kind of set the soil for longer term life and health outcomes. So I really wonder how big a role then does the microbiome, both for mother and baby in that early stage, really dictate long-term outcomes? Because, me myself, I would say I've got a, pretty decent microbiome based on some testing I've done, and I feel good, which is, I would say the best clinical indication, more so than any test. However, I was a C-section baby. So, I didn't get the, vaginal flora during birth, which, it's you can't really decide if you're going to be a C-section or vaginal, in many cases. But that has been shown to have, different or worsened outcomes versus, vaginal, the sort of natural way of going about life. So I really wonder if there are things that we can do proactively to just focus on that microbiome a bit more in that pregnancy stage, which then comes into the fact that maybe, instead of suggesting all of these crazy diets to, pregnant women, we do ask them to do some of the most basic thing, which is focus on a diverse range of plants and fiber in that diet, because you're already saying, hey, we're going to give you a baseline, microbiome to good effect that you can then pass on to your child.
You've touched on so many things. I'm smiling so much because there's this amazing piece of research that was done by the MRC group in Gambia. So one of my professors, Andrew Prentice at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, led the work, and they have basically been following up a birth cohort for over 60 years. And what they found was one of the best predictors of long-term chronic disease sort of risk was maternal diet preconception. So what they did was they looked at maternal diet for women who fell pregnant in the summer months. So they had been exposed to fresh leafy greens in spring, preconception. And then those women who fell pregnant in the sort of midwinter. So were mostly eating dried goods and stored as opposed to fresh vegetables and fruits. And the health outcomes of the two groups in the long term, including all-cause mortality risk, type 2 diabetes, was significantly different. So it points to this idea that actually preconception diet, now this is obviously quite a stark contrast in this population, but preconception diet and the gut microbiome is really important when we consider the fact that the vaginal microbiome has to be a welcoming environment for pregnancy to succeed. Now, our gut microbiome loves to be diverse. It loves to have lots of different good microbes that are all doing good work. And what we're trying to do with our gut microbiome is feed the good guys and crowd out the slightly worse guys who have a more likely pro-inflammatory effect. But in the vaginal microbiome, diversity is not king. Like the vaginal microbiome likes to have mostly lactobacilli. It doesn't like diversity. But what's really interesting is that there is this gut microbiome, vaginal microbiome axis. And you see that there's a support from the gut microbiome to maintain a really nice, stable, lactobacillus rich environment in the vagina. So it can actually really help with the fertility itself. So actually getting pregnant, if you have a healthy gut microbiome, which influences the vaginal microbiome, it also influences the immune system, as we've touched on, you have a higher likelihood of pregnancy. Now, during pregnancy, what you eat, exactly as you said, maternal microbiome is critical, especially in the third trimester. Well, actually, it's critical throughout. What we know is that if there is a vaginal microbiome change in the second to third trimester, which is unfavorable, you have much heightened risk of preterm labor. So you see these signals. There's some really interesting science around signals in the vaginal microbiome. So women, for example, who have more like recurring bacterial vaginosis are at higher risk of preterm labor. And there's some really interesting science around gum disease and preterm labor. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's brilliant. It's this translocation of pro-inflammatory microbes that you see. And you can actually, women who have periodontal disease in pregnancy are at higher risk of preterm labor. And even if you treat the periodontal disease, you actually don't massively reduce the risk. So it's one of these things that it's a good idea. Basically, floss your teeth before you get pregnant and brush regularly. But so there's this real connection of all the microbiomes talking to each other and sustaining the healthiest possible flora to sustain the pregnancy. Now, if the vaginal microbiome is disrupted, there's a dysbiosis, you have this increased risk. We think that the gut microbiome is helping to manage the vaginal microbiome and keep it stable until we get to the third trimester. In the third trimester, you start to see some key species that you would find in the gut microbiome appear in the vaginal microbiome. And the theory is that it's creating a sort of a blueprint of like initial species that when the baby comes out and inhales all the vaginal microbiome fluids, and it's a messy process, they then inherit some of these species. Now, we also know that during birth, it's not actually all through the vaginal microbiome. Baby also is exposed to maternal basically poo and microbiome from the back end, right? So this is all to say that there's these changes in the gut microbiome, changes in the vaginal microbiome that are there to support the baby with like a healthy inoculation of the best species when it comes out and seed the blueprint for like the initial gut microbiome that the baby will then evolve. Now, you said you're a cesarean section baby. So I have two children. My first child was born by vaginal delivery, and my second was cesarean section. She was breech. It would not have been safe to deliver her. She was butt first, literally. So what's interesting is that when you look at the data for outcomes, there is this difference between vaginal delivery and cesarean delivery, which starts to sort of like the difference really decreases by the second year of life between the two, especially if they're breastfed. So if babies are breastfed, mode of delivery is important, but breastfeeding can actually really equalize that. So if I agree with you. If you need a cesarean section, like please take it. It's medically necessary. But breastfeeding is the key behavior or the key exposure in babies that really helps to build a healthy gut microbiome, which then helps to build a really great, healthy immune system. And I think breastfeeding is where, so I think pregnancy nutrition, fertility nutrition, and early childhood are very emotional. People get very emotional, of course, like it's a really important time of life. And most often, the people who engage with it are those who have had some sort of hurdle, right? So instantly, there's this like guilt that comes with, did I do something wrong? Did I not take the right thing? Did I not eat the right way? Did I have that one drink on the night that we conceived this child? So it's all this guilt that's wrapped up. And what I'm really keen on is not adding to that, because a lot of it does fall on the mother's shoulders. And it's this like pressure. What I want to see in my lifetime is what we talked about earlier. So this like renewed focus and support for procreation. So like at the moment, the way that our environment is shaped, the way our work life is shaped, even the way our taxes are shaped, don't really help parents to have children. in the UK, I think US is fairly similar. Some Nordic countries do a better job than we do. And I think we need to change the way we think about children and parenthood and shift it back to, actually, this is quite important for us, for there to be children in society, because they are going to be the ones that will be looking after us when we're older. And there's going to be a lot of us older people. So let's support people who want to have children with the best possible tools to have the healthiest possible pregnancies and children themselves. But it needs to be a societal change. So why does this link to breastfeeding? Because telling women you should breastfeed, like it's the best thing for you and your baby, whilst true, ignores the fact that we've completely basically cut out breastfeeding clinics. The NHS defunded them years ago. There's very few left. There is very little training for midwives and nurses and even healthcare, like the health visitors, on breastfeeding specifically, and like helping support women with that. We don't educate women or their partners on breastfeeding. And so you go into this, you have this baby, you get sent home. No one warned me. Like, I was already doing research in this space at this point, and I still didn't quite realize it was going to be a full-time job for about 4 weeks. Like 8 hours of my day every day was spent breastfeeding my newborn, which if you've done it, you're like, yeah, obviously. But until you've done it, you're like, what? Sorry.
It's a new journey,
So it's a job, right? Now, just educating so you can know what to expect is important. Now, the second really, really important thing is not everyone is able to breastfeed. And not every family has a breastfeeding parent, right? So how do we support those families to make sure that the first thing they can access is human breast milk as opposed to formula? I have no shade with formula. It helps save babies' lives, right? But we are lacking in choice. We don't have, like Brazil in their public health system, offer human donor breast milk to babies who need feeding. It's possible, but there is no infrastructure and there's no political will to actually set that up in this country. So there are plenty of mothers who produce more milk than their babies need. We know how to make it safe to make human donor breast milk. And here is just not a choice. Now, some people might think, oh, gross, I don't want to give another person's milk to my baby. That's fine. But at least give people the choice. You can have formula milk, which is, as you know, it's just condensed. It's essentially just powdered cow's milk with added nutrients to it. Or you can have human donor breast milk, which has been safety checked and has had all the checks it needs. It's very safe. You get it from people who have health screening. Like, there's ways to make human donor breast milk a really valuable second choice if breastfeeding is not available to your newborn.
Another interesting inflection point in a person's life where there's more physiological changes is in that perimenopause, menopause stage as well, where there's clearly a lot of hormonal shifts, physiological changes, and, even from a digestive physiology point of view, there's delayed gut transit, lower GI gastrointestinal motility, increased risk of constipation. The gut microbiome also changes, maybe as a result of those things that I've just mentioned as well. But also from a cardiovascular perspective, it raises their risk because of the plummeting estrogen levels and the hormonal fluctuations. There could also be an increased risk of heart attacks, decreased bone density. So there's a number of changes happen which can be to a woman's detriment. So again, there's a huge nutrient shift in the profile of nutrients possibly required in that stage. So when a woman is coming to that, perimenopause, menopause stage, what are some things that can change from a dietary perspective, or things that we should be shifting to saying, hang on, we can't just simply focus on the same old diet. So what can change in terms of protein, fiber, individual micronutrients to support that stage of life?
So as you said, there's this cardiometabolic effect of menopause, and there's also this musculoskeletal effect of menopause, and both have been studied. So we at Zoe have done the largest nutrition study looking at the effects of diet on menopause, and also what dietary factors predict the severity of symptoms. And what's really interesting is that you just touched on the fact that change in gut motility is exactly right. That's due to the progesterone and estrogen fluctuations. But also we know that the gut microbiome composition is changing quite significantly. So in our own research, we looked at whether the gut microbiome change was mediating part of the metabolic response change. And we found that it was. So it's really interesting that there's this multi-pronged change, which is led by the hormone shifts, but then leads to actual changes in gut microbiome composition. So some people call this the estrobolome. We don't know loads of detail about it, but there is clearly this subsection of the ecosystem, which is very impacted when estrogen does fall off a cliff, if you will. You see there's like a gap in the gut microbiome and in this ecosystem that is then filled by either gut microbes that are going to support your health or gut microbes that aren't really supportive. So what I always like to think about and frame it in this phase of life is there's all these changes happening. And within the change, there's an opportunity to fill this gut microbiome gap. So if you can feed your gut microbes as best as possible at this time, you're going to support the change to be better as opposed to detrimental. So think of it as your garden. Winter's coming. You can prepare your garden to be really great and flourishing next spring, or you might find that it's not at its best next spring. Now, what's really important, I think what we found in our research, which was really surprising, is often there's well understood factors that predispose women to a worse menopause transition. One of them is having a higher BMI. There's also so this excess adiposity, I should be clear on that. It's not about, if you're really musty, you're in a better position, but this excess adiposity puts you at higher risk of having worse symptoms that are longer and then having worse metabolic health profile as well. It's what you just touched on. It's really important for women to realize that post-menopause, they do have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Often cardiovascular disease needs to get more attention anyway, because it's our biggest killer. But often women don't think of it as their problem because it's, men are at a higher risk most of their lives, but then we catch up with them after menopause. So what we found in our research is that women who had the highest intake of plants. So we measured this with the HPDI. So as you know, it's just how many whole plants are you having in your diet? That was the best predictor for having a lower symptom severity and number of symptoms. Even if you had excess adiposity, So that, to me, like, that's such a strong signal. Okay, it didn't matter whether you were, like, what age you entered menopause, or even if you were taking HRT, you could reduce the number and severity of symptoms if you just had a really high plant diet. So then the next step was, when we did the intervention study, we looked at when, before starting, in this case, Zoe was the intervention. So engaging with Zoe's recommendations, which, as you know, are eating more plants, eating more whole grains, eating more fermented foods, using healthier fats, all these things. Before they started, and then we measured at several time points throughout their sort of membership. So we created a new way of measuring menopause symptoms called the Menoscale, which is in conjunction with the British Menopause Society. It's a free to access tool. Anyone can use it. And the reason we created it is we're very lucky. We have an all-female science team at Zoe. And we were like, what we found was that previous scales had quite annoying language in them. So there was things like, do you feel irritable? It's like, well, now I kind of do, actually. So we created
you feel hysteric.
Yeah, exactly. So we created something that was more modern language and covered all the main symptom buckets. And what was really exciting about this piece of research is that across the board, we saw a reduction in, we were measuring not just the number of symptoms or how severe they were, but how were they impacting daily life? Now, that in itself was really revealing, because often people talk about hot flushes or, night sweats. And whilst they're very common for a lot of women, they're not the ones that they report as having the most disruption on their quality of life. So they can be quite severe night sweats, but actually quality of life impact isn't as big. As in our research, we found, and since over 70,000 women, we found that the symptoms that had the most impact on quality of life were certainly the mood, anxiety, the brain fog. So what you'd consider the sort of brain symptoms. And across the board on all the symptoms, apart from the vaginal symptoms, which makes sense, vaginal dryness, we saw a reduction of about 35% on the Menoscale when people engaged with this dietary change. Now, that was way more than we thought. So we expected some movement, and we saw this like 35% reduction in women who were taking HRT. So women who were taking HRT tended to have a lower baseline. So they came in reporting less of a disruption, but they still saw over a third reduction in the disruption. And the women who weren't taking HRT similarly saw this 35% reduction. But the group of symptoms that saw the biggest improvement were the brain health symptoms. And there we were like, well, this is clearly something here is going out with the gut-brain axis, has to be part of this picture, because so we've seen this change in gut microbiome composition. We've seen that it's mediating the metabolic effects of menopause. And then we see that the best outcomes women have when they change their diet to essentially be more plant diverse, they see this big improvement on their brain symptoms. So that was really exciting, because what's happened in the past 5 years or so is we've built, not just us, but there's an arsenal of tools that are being built for women to access in approaching their menopause, perimenopause, and postmenopause, to really help arm them to be in the best possible health, reduce their risk of chronic disease, actually not suffer too badly with their the symptom severity, quality of life, and then come out the other side in really good shape, essentially. So what are the things that have come up? So this high plant diversity is key.
Yeah.
If we're talking about individual nutrients, there is some compelling evidence coming out on specific phytoestrogens. So we know that women's populations where tofu and soy products are consumed in higher amounts, which contain these phytoestrogens, there is a reduced symptom severity of menopause at sort of population level. So we had that signal anyway. And now scientists are looking at identifying specific phytoestrogens that seem to be doing most of that work. And what's really interesting there is you can predict phytoestrogen effect on symptom severity through gut microbiome composition.
So I think importantly, that phytoestrogen, a lot of people then use that kernel of truth, and that phytoestrogens could be useful, and then make the sort of negative claim that they could have an estrogenic effect, which we probably don't have enough proof for in humans, just in animals. And so people say that men who are taking eating lots of soy or eating
Yeah.
lots of tofu and things like that
Are more
have this
feminine.
sort of feminizing effect. Yeah, which I think that's where the sort of misunderstanding
Has
comes
come
from a
from.
lot of
Yeah,
people.
that's been debunked. So there's lots of
Yeah.
science to show that men who have even very high soy consumption, so we're talking 5 portions a day, have their testosterone's fine. Like that does
Yeah.
not have a feminizing effect. There's loads of like men needn't worry, and frankly, men in Western countries don't consume that much soy product as a general rule. So if your concern comes from soy protein isolate because you're taking a protein supplement, like don't worry about it. It's fine. But for women, it can have this effect, and we think it's actually mediated by the gut microbiome. It's actually not a
Yeah.
direct estrogenic effect. So that's
Yeah.
really compelling. We're working now on some analysis of exactly this, so understanding at sort of species and strain level what gut microbiome composition is doing for impacting menopause symptoms and phytoestrogen activation. So that's like the next step in understanding this. And you could get to a point where we could actually let women know, like, oh yeah, you have the gut microbes that would actually be really helpful for you if you had these phytoestrogens, whereas like maybe you don't have them, so don't worry too much about taking this supplement or eating more soy because you'll have less of a benefit. So we can personalize the advice, which is really exciting. But as a general rule, if you're able to, so interestingly now, a lot of women are having children later. So there's this really, that I call them, I have patients I see one-on-one in clinic who are like postnatal perimenopausal. So there's this like real overlap, and it's about really supporting that shift in diet at that time. It's a very good time to make the decision to change your diet for the best. So increase your plant diversity, eat plenty of leafy greens, make sure that you're thinking about your heart health, think about the dietary fat quality that you have. So if you're eating, if you're cooking with butter or using saturated fat, or perhaps you're using like bacon or sausages or lardons to flavor things a lot, think about, okay, can we actually index more towards the omega-3 fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, using extra virgin olive oil, using nuts and seeds, using seed oils, using these oils that are much better for our cardiac health, cardiovascular health, because we do need to start thinking about protecting our heart more. And there is this almost not instant, but you do see that many women report like a sudden increase in cholesterol levels, sudden increase in triglyceride levels. Like all their blood work comes back different post-menopause.
I think if you actually, a lot of people nowadays are aware of the understanding now that, a high intake of plant foods is good, and that's the evidence supports that as well. And there's also people who maybe make the pendulum swing completely the other way and almost insinuate that having any animal foods in your diet could be bad. And I think actually, the most recent publication by Nature, where they followed up over 100,000 people.
I love that paper.
And they followed those healthy aging patterns. And, they showed that essentially you don't need to cut out any animal sources from your diet, but just have a moderate intake of that, but prioritize, the plant foods. And they showed that the highest centile, which had the sort of healthy aging patterns in those people who were followed up, those 105,000 people who were followed up for 30 years, found that the highest diversity of plant food intake, the richest concentration of plant food intake with minimal, animal sources of food, reach that sort of healthy aging target. And as long as if you're an omnivore and you're eating plant foods and you're eating a little bit of animal foods, just ensuring that your consumption of salts, trans fats, unsaturated fats saturated fats is low. That's better than, being sort of dogmatic about being a pure vegan or just being a carnivore and avoiding that restriction in either sense.
I love that I love that paper. I like read it so avidly. I was like, this is so good. The analyses they did in it are so elegant. When you just think, oh, I wonder who the statistician was. But anyway, so what I love about that is exactly as you said. And actually, we found a very similar thing. We published a paper in Nature Microbiology about gut microbiome composition and different dietary patterns. And similarly, we found that it was the people who reported eating the most variety of plants that had the sort of most favorable gut microbiome composition. And in this in the paper you just talked about, which was part of the nurses' health study and the physicians' health study, they have essentially the way that they looked at healthy aging was who reached age 70 without one of the 5 major chronic conditions affecting their health, and then 75. And only 10% of this cohort reached that. And these are nurses and doctors. So these are health literate, generally healthier people. So that for me is like the first thing to point out is, what is your goal? Because often, whenever I talk about protein intake or animal intake, I inevitably get comments being like, "What do you know?" Like, those kinds of comments. And my sort of question is always, well, what's your goal? Because if your goal is to live to 70 without dementia, without heart attack, without heart disease, without type 2 diabetes, without a cancer, then the science is super clear that we should be over-indexing on plant diversity, and then including animal foods almost as a side dish or a treat or something that you have occasionally, but really building the majority of your diet based on plants. If your goal is to compete at a bikini bodybuilding competition in 2 months' time, first of all, I'm not your gal because that's not my specialty. And secondly, maybe carnivore diet is best. Although the evidence I've seen for muscle composition and muscle sort of building muscle actually points to soy protein isolate and pea protein isolate being as effective as whey. So I'm not even sure that that's a good use case. But I always say to people, what's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? If it is this long-term health, reduction in chronic disease risk, look at the Mediterranean dietary pyramid. Have a good look at it. It's mostly whole grains, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, leafy greens, fruits and vegetables. And then you can have fatty fish is the preferred animal source because of the omega-3 fatty acids. Fermented dairy is the other one, which consistently shows better health outcomes. So yogurts and traditional cheeses and things like that. And then you can, if you want to eat chicken and you want to have some beef occasionally, you can, but it really shouldn't form the majority of your diet. And this is where people get really het up. As you said, it's more religious. It's like, I once was called part of the plant-based, what was it? Part of the plant-based agenda.
Right.
And I didn't even know there was one, but I'm not vegan. And even if I was, the evidence is there for what the healthy dietary pattern can look like. So it's not about what I like to do. It's about advising people for the health goal they have. But yeah, this latest analysis was so clear in showing. Also, did you see the sub-analysis they did where they essentially showed that increased total protein intake doesn't improve long-term health outcomes?
There's diminishing gains with anything like that. I mean, we haven't really defined a sort of the diminishing gains for fiber, for example, but for protein, we pretty much know that while our body can handle a pool of amino acids throughout the day, and we can sort of eat 200 grams of protein or 150 grams probably should be sufficient for the average population to maximize any muscle protein synthesis they have. But like you said, after a point, is there any difference or benefit from you having 250 grams of protein versus just 150 grams of protein, depending on your goals and things like that? But ultimately, if someone is consuming 250 grams of protein and the bulk of that coming from animal protein, for example, then there's just less room in the tank for plants. Even if you desire to have more plants, you just might not have the physical stomach capacity for it. And this is coming from an omnivore who has reduced his meat-based agenda to increase the plant-based agenda.
Yeah. And I think it's exactly that. I also think we don't eat macros. So people always say to me, like, what's the ideal gram per kilogram? And I think, who has the mental space to calculate this? I don't, right? And it's my literal job. So I always say, like, if you're having a variety of foods, all 20 amino acids are in all plants. So we don't need to worry about this complete protein thing. Like, you do have to have a variety of plants to make sure you get enough of each amino acid. But most of us will eat eggs. Most of us will eat some fish. Most of us will eat some cheese and yogurt. So regardless, we're getting some really good protein sources, right? If you just eat enough food So the places where we really see protein deficiency, which is very rare in the general population, but where we do see it is where people can't or don't eat enough food. So whether that is because of restriction, or whether that is because you are in a metabolically demanding state like cancer, or recovering from major trauma such as surgery or burns, okay, those populations have really got to focus on increasing their protein intake to support health, right? But for the majority of us, if we're eating enough whole foods, if we're eating enough food, we will actually be getting enough protein. Like the most recent estimates suggest between the adults in the UK and the US get between 1 gram per kilogram and 1.3 gram per kilogram of what we eat just by eating food without supplementing, right? Now, the best evidence I've seen suggests that if you're actively building muscle, so if you're training, weight training, resistance training, like actually increasing your load, so actively building muscle, you want to be going for about 1.6 grams per kilogram, right? Now so if you're in that group, then that's where you really think, okay, have I included some tofu, some tempeh, or some chicken, or some extra fish? Maybe that's a good use case. But for the majority of us, just eating food is already providing enough for us to maintain a healthy body composition. And critically, we have to do the movement for the body composition. Just eating, so just being like, oh yeah, I've got plenty of protein today. But if you're not moving and you're not not making your muscles work in any way, that's not going to do it by itself.
Yeah.
So I sometimes find myself getting into debates with people who will think that just going to the gym or doing like an exercise class 3 times a week makes them an athlete. That's just bare minimum exercise. Unfortunately, we are very sedentary now. So we don't think about movement throughout the day, and going to like formal exercise 3 times a week is the bare minimum that's recommended. So we have to also remember that it's important to eat protein-rich foods. You can absolutely eat protein-rich foods with a plant-based, plant-forward diet, not vegan, but you can absolutely get enough protein. And at the same time, you have to also prioritize movement, because otherwise you won't get that optimal body composition that many people are striving to get.
You know, I sort of in this kind of space of online where a lot of so-called experts talk about nutrition, I continue to be impressed by not only how eloquently you talk about nutrition research, but also, you know, you're in the trenches and you're pumping out high quality research. So, you know, thank you so much for enlightening everyone just about the intricacies of just how varied and personalized nutrition is, and how we shouldn't be bogged down into these silos and these camps, and just, you know, allow people to be a bit more flexible about thinking of nutrition. So thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. I think what you're doing is brilliant as well. And just bringing evidence-based content in a way that's approachable, but also actionable is super important, because to your point, when food becomes a source of anxiety, and when people start to think that their nutrition is actually a mental burden for them, we failed. Like, food is one of life's greatest pleasures, and our bodies are exquisitely designed to make the most of everything we eat. We have very effective absorption. Our microbiome is supporting us. So in some ways, I really love for people to feel that they can just take a step back, engage with eating more nutritious foods, and then let your body do the rest. Stop trying to count all these random numbers that are useful in research, but actually day-to-day life, they're just extra mental baggage. We don't need it.
Very stressful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.